Hi, my name's Vikram Rangnekar. I'm the guy who created this project, Supergraph. So this is the first time I'm kind of presenting it, so I'm excited. And my browser, you can see I've killed like 100 tabs, so you guys don't think I'm insane. So it's a lot of sacrifice there. All those tabs died for this talk. Okay, so a quick question. How many of you use Rails or have used Rails in the past? And Postgres, I guess, equal. So, all right, so I love Go, but I use Rails a lot just because I can, throw some gems together and get something going over a weekend. And with Go, I'm still like writing all my basic HTTP code, right? And I have some projects that are doing relatively well. They have a lot of traffic, and I need to kind of build on them. But I hate like building CRUD APIs. I don't know if you guys are familiar with those. It's basically the create, update, list, show, whatever. It's you always need to do them. You have a list of products. You need to display them, have a way to edit them, like kind of format them into nice cards or lists. And there's always that need to go back, update the API, and say, oh, let's add this extra field here, or let's just like vomit out all the fields. And then you have all these decisions around how you want to structure the controllers. Do you want it to be like, user ID / product ID, or you just want to like make it one level? And honestly, after like a while, it doesn't sound interesting. I want to go, to build the more interesting parts of the project and just have this stuff just work. I've taken the trouble, I've defined the schema in the database, I have all the types in there, I have the relationships defined, all the foreign keys saying, okay, the the product belongs to the user and the user belongs to the account, and all of that stuff. Taken all that trouble, and then I have to go and write all this active record code to join, and it's the same stuff after a while. And so I wanted something different. I was kind of lazy to do that, honestly. So, when coders are lazy, they want to go and write more code. So I kind of like decided this was the way I could, spend some time productively. So what Supergraph is it's basically a Go service that talks to your database directly and learns the schema of your database and the relationships within the database and just basically exposes GraphQL API. Honestly, I'm not like an old-time GraphQL person that was always into it or anything. I started looking into it as a solution to this problem where I can like ask for the data I want from the endpoint when I'm like building my Vue or React endpoint, and not have to keep changing the backend or kind of match and context switch, which is kind of annoying, especially between going from like Vue or JavaScript land back to like Rails or Go, whatever, right? And I just wanted to like build things, try out stuff, and move faster. And that's kind of the motivation to build Supergraph. So what Supergraph basically does is it takes in a GraphQL query. Let me show you a query. Sorry. Yeah. Like that. It says query, email, ID, and you execute it. You get the query, and I decide I want the guy's name, so I can just kind of throw it in there. I'll be like, okay, also send me his full name. Right there, that full name.
Can you zoom in a little bit? Is that possible?
Sorry?
Can you zoom in a little bit on what you're doing?
Sure, maybe. No, I'm just trying to. Oh. I guess that'll have to do. So yeah, the way Supergraph does it is essentially it is a compiler. It takes GraphQL in, and it actually does all those steps that compilers do that you've been taught in your computer science class, builds all the abstract syntax trees and all of that, and then compiles to efficient Postgres code. So if you have a query, kind of like let me find a more, okay, maybe this one. This is a more complex query. So there. So it essentially compiles it down to one SQL query. So I'm not gonna like get into that, but just know it's a pretty efficient single query that does everything you need it to do. You could even have like relationships, like you could have like let me add a user in there, and maybe have his email, and right there would extend that relationship and give you that the user connected to that product. Now here in this query, it actually does a lot more. If you see, it's using so GraphQL by itself is just a standard. It tells you that okay, you have to have this word query when you want to query. You have to have the name of something. They call it a select, and then you can have arguments passed to it within the the arguments up to you. The orange one, the red stuff is the arguments, and then you pass in the the fields that you want returned back, or you can like extend it and have a child thing in there. So, but what the arguments are is up to you. So essentially, Supergraph has defined its own set of arguments that you have to work with. For example, search. Search actually exposes Postgres's full text search capabilities, so which are pretty extensive for those who've gone into that. So it builds, like Postgres actually does a lot of what Elasticsearch does. It has the term vector indexes and all of that. And just saying search something actually goes down and it does that on the back end. The where clause, you can say, okay, search for ales, but like I want the price to be less than 10. So you can kind of do that there. You can say order by the search rank. This is information that Postgres returns, like search rank, or you can say headline description. This is actually something Postgres returns as part of its search API. Will tell you that, oh, the word ale, it showed up here. Let me just like put a bold tag around it or whatever. So essentially, we've plonked like this pretty flexible GraphQL API right on top of Postgres. And the beauty of Supergraph is at least it was built for my use case, so it works with Rails apps. And what I mean by that is it understands the Rails cookie, and it appreciates the Rails database schema, the way you define tables and stuff. It can technically kind of work even outside of that, but let's just go with the fact that it likes that. And if you say have a Rails app running on example.com or whatever, and you deploy Supergraph to graphql.example.com, now your cookie flows through Supergraph too, and you can essentially decode that cookie, take out the member ID, and use that internally in the queries if you need it to. So if I'm asking for all of this stuff, if you notice I'm passing in like a user ID here, I could technically change that, and it would return different results because maybe on the table products you have a filter in the backend that says, hey, I only want for the member himself. So I can show you some of that. So yeah, essentially, okay, so that's a web UI. So yeah, it also supports JWT tokens. So if that's the way you do authentication, something like Auth0, it works with that. Queries get compiled to efficient output. That's not like, there's a lot wrong in that SQL output. I just kind of like wanted to make it fit. So there are all kinds of queries you can run. I'll show you some examples. And it's essentially configured through one config file. It can be YAML, JSON, or whatever. If you look at this config file, it's ignore the variable stuff on top. But say we look at, okay, I mean, so look at this default filter. So on all tables, apply this filter. Say user ID equals user ID. So essentially, when it has a user ID, either it's got it from like the cookie or the JWT or whatever, it will insert this like into the where clause. So you will never get data back that's not for that user. Essentially, that's what we do in code in Rails. You do current user dot whatever. And so you can blacklist fields. You can say, okay, never return, no matter what, don't return the password field, don't return the secret token field. Doesn't matter what table it's in. You can add filters per table. You can say, okay, for users, have this filter. For products, have these two, but not the user filter. Stuff like that. So like, if I go back here and sorry, let me just change this. I say query user ID. So you notice it sends back just ID 2, but if I change that to say 5, that's just, I'm simulating the cookie by having this in the header. It will just return for 5, So it's pretty fast because it's all Go, it's multi-threaded and all of that. The request basically comes into this Go service, which compiles it down to one SQL query and then goes directly to database. So it's quite performant. The compiled query is cached. So, even though the compiling is pretty fast in milliseconds, over time, the caching even prevents garbage collection and stuff like that. So, it's a young project, but it's quite scalable. There are a bunch of tests. Bad about writing those, but I've taken the trouble. And I'm quite excited to be working on this. It's something that's solving my problem, so I'm working more on it, and it's actually making me think about building products in different ways. I was like, if I take a really interesting I have some ideas around migrations, and if I couple this with a migrations like a framework, then essentially you can just build your database using the migrations, have this on top, and not need anything else. Yes, right now I only support querying, which is why it's nice to be coupled with Rails. But I'm adding mutations, which is basically the ability to actually create stuff. This is right now only read-only. And subscriptions, which is another thing that GraphQL supports, where you can basically subscribe to something and keep getting updates about it. It's the same query that's run continuously or something. So yeah, and it's because of Go, it compiles down to this really tiny Docker file, less than 20 MB, and it does a bunch of stuff. So it's pretty extensively documented. So if you go down there, you will see things like how to GraphQL with this. So there are all the different types of queries we support. These are all the var expressions we support, and there are quite a few. So Postgres has columns where you can actually have JSON data in them, and you can do all kinds of special querying directly into JSON. You don't even need a JSON like Mongo anymore, honestly. And this supports those queries onto those kind of columns too. There's aggregation, so you can literally add the word count or max in front of a thing, and you will get a count or a max, or run an aggregation on it. There's full text search, and it's got a bunch of stuff. And also there's some guides around installing it in different environments, like if your Rails setup is on Kubernetes, or how you can build your own Docker image, or all of that stuff. So so I hope you guys give it a shot, and I'm excited. I'm actively working on it. So thank you. So yeah, that's a great question, and that's where these filters come in the config. So you basically add a filter. Essentially, a filter is it inserts a where clause it appends a where clause to whatever your request is. So if your request is for, say, get me users, then it would automatically add the ID equals user ID to that request. So essentially, when you ask for users, you have no option but to have that where appended in the backend. So you'll only get your user back. But if you want to change it up, you can use something like this. You can say me. You can create a new field, and you can say, okay, this is a proxy for the users table, but has a different filter on it. So essentially, your filters will control what data is returned back to you. And this user ID is something that's built in, but you can define your own variables. For example, if you have like a SaaS setup where you need a user ID plus account ID, then you can have an embedded query in there. You can say, okay, insert this query essentially into wherever the filter is, and it's kind of built. It's a subquery that gets inserted, and
so I would think this would cover probably 95% of the cases. Mm-hmm. There's always complex access control you need to do at some.
Completely true. And I think initially I just went for that kind of 95, and I want to extend it ability to have a little bit of code to take care of those conditions. Or maybe give it I'll call in a different endpoint, and based on that, and there are always corner cases, and I'm trying to slowly figure my way through that. But essentially being able to create these variables and have your own SQL kind of injected as part of it. So in this case, account ID will be derived from this query. So you can insert it there, and you can literally say if account ID equals account underscore ID, then it will always do that query based on the user's account and then match it. So you can have complex queries in there, and yeah. That, I know the account ID and the tenant thing comes when you have this multi-tenanted SaaS setups, and I have one of those, so kind of use that. Yeah.
So Graph, SuperGraph, understand Postgres and also Rail. How do you do the analyze the database in?
So essentially, Postgres is, you can query for anything. So when the service comes up, it has this query, complex query that basically asks Postgres, can you give me a list of all the tables you have? And then it says, can you give me all the columns in the tables? Can you tell me all the foreign keys and the primary keys? And basically on that, it builds like a graph, relationship graph, where it knows what table connects to what. And then it can basically derive those Rails relationships, one to many, many to one. Sometimes there's a many to many through like a join table or like a belongs to. So it can essentially walk that graph and know that. So you can say, give me user, or give me the products of for a user, and the backend Java, and the way, it's the same way Rails would essentially kind of do it, but it's a little more complex here, where join table then connects the second one to the first one. But Postgres has this thing called lateral cross joins, which are a little more sophisticated that I'm using. And so I'm trying to use a lot of like the cool stuff that Postgres is now. Like Postgres is really surprisingly great. I mean, I tell people this, a lot of application code out there are people reinventing Postgres, like efficient C code written by Postgres for developers, just because they don't want to learn SQL. Right? It's like I know lots of great engineers who you kind of start digging into SQL, and like I recently started digging into it.
So basically it ties to the Postgres. How difficult it is that we have a MySQL backend?
It will not work because there's a lot of stuff that's very Postgres, like the cross-lateral queries or like windowing functions that Postgres has. I don't know. I haven't really dug in and seen what MySQL has. I think what you mean is MariaDB, because I think MySQL is now like I don't know, it's owned by Oracle and people don't want to touch it or something. So, and MariaDB I think has a lot of issues right now. It's still not there. I think Postgres, because of all of that, Postgres has really got the lead, and it's really like even Rails apps. I think it's default Postgres now. It used to be MySQL. So yeah.
So you said it was coupled to Rails, but
Yes.
it sounds like from what you described in terms of throwing the tables, you can totally use it without Rails. Can you talk a bit more about the coupling part?
Yes, so you're kind of right. I mean, but I do certain things that are like Rails, even though the word I say user here, it's really the tables as users, because like Rails has that. So I'm using some of that information that Rails has, the conventions, but I am working on getting rid of them. Like if I say users here, it'll actually make that into an array because it's expecting more than one. But yes, I mean, and the second thing is the member ID, right? I mean, so it actually understands a Rails cookie. It can decode it. Or if you're using like a session store like Redis or Memcache, you can actually look into that and get the member ID out. And Rails is kind of complicated because they have it's changed a lot. Those cookies are encrypted, they're signed. There's a different format for before version 5.2 and after 5.2 and 6. So it kind of understands all of that. So that was a little bit of effort to get right. And yeah. Yeah,
and follow Rails conventions.
it would work, and that's where I'm heading to. I don't want, but like I said, it's only read-only. It doesn't have the mutation part yet, so you need something that will like write and create stuff. Yeah, like all this data, I'm just using a seed function to generate it. So, sorry, you had a question?
Yeah, it was more along the lines.
Okay.
Of so there's no Go client to actually interface with it. You'd still have to go through Rails too.
No, there's an exposed endpoint. It's actually its own service exposed.
I would have to write my own client to interface with.
No, you just make a post request. So it's essentially if you go into, say, the documentation and Where is that? Right here. If you look, it's just a curl call. So it's essentially a JSON application post with the GraphQL query right there. So I mean, you can just directly from your browser using the fetch API or whatever, you can just have JavaScript call this directly. You don't call the endpoint for your Rails APIs. You call the one for here. I mean, it can be on a separate domain in certain cases, but if you're using like an ingress with Kubernetes, then it could technically be on the same domain. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, so if the schema were to change while this service was running, how would it react to that?
So that's interesting. It would not, but I would expect you to have to restart the service too. I'm trying to figure out ways around that. Essentially, like as this does more, like if your schema changes, you're probably going to change the config files. It's kind of like you're rebuilding the Docker image. I like there's this concept called immutable infrastructure where you kind of build these Docker images, change the config, and it all changes. So I'm kind of going with that. So yeah.
Well, first of all, well done on sharing this and open sourcing it, right? It's awesome.
Thank you.
Do you see this tool mainly as a rapid prototyping tool or eventually like full-fledged production ready to go?
Honestly, I see it as full-fledged. Like I want to build my apps on it. So I'm just the stuff that that annoys me about like experimenting and building new apps is what I want to solve with this. So it's this Go code that's written once and for all. I can just like change the config files, point it to the whatever database, and write the migrations, and just have a new app. Then I can focus on the UI or whatever, right?
So if that's where this is going, how do you imagine architecting the more complicated or subtle business logic that might
So fair enough. I mean, I'm still thinking about it. There could be an embedded language where you could have certain subtle things you could call out. So if you needed to do something more complex, like sending out emails and those kind of things, you could have it automatically, every creation could call a webhook, could be like a Lambda function or something, could go and just do that specialized thing, or another service. It could have there's a lot happening where now there are all these gvisor and all these like virtual environments where you can like plug into Go. You can have Go like execute functions of different languages and stuff. I'm thinking about it. Essentially, I've seen my use case a lot of times. Yes, that's there, and that's why kind of the Rails part is. But you know what? I don't have a good answer for you. I need to myself run into some of these use cases, but I know they're out there. I just hope that maybe the config and SQL can deal with them, because SQL deals with so much, and maybe there's a way you could have your own GraphQL in the back end to kind of like, because you can have more. GraphQL supports things like if-else clauses, and I haven't even got all of that in there yet. So yeah.
So Postgres has a lot of like pub/sub functionality built in as well. Have you investigated like hooking any of that?
I have. It's not as scalable. It's less invested in. It's kind of like someone's built it. It's there, but it's it's kind of complicated and it's not widely used. But yeah, maybe that's definitely something. Like I'm a big fan. Like I think Postgres can do a lot for everyone. Even authentication, some of this filter stuff that you see here. This filter stuff, most people don't know that Postgres has row-level access control. So you can tell Postgres that every time someone inserts into this table or requests from this table, add this filter to it. So you can literally build your entire authentication just directly in Postgres migrations if you want it. So yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about the sort of compiling GraphQL queries to Postgres queries? Like, are you doing that by hand, or is there any libraries that you use to make that better, or is that?
That's a great question. That's actually the most fun part. So I thought about different ways to go about this, and essentially then I started thinking of it as a compilation step. And in Go, the Go's own compiler is written in Go, so it's something you can kind of go in to read. And I did read, and surprisingly, there was even a talk by Rob Pike around their lexical analyzer that he built for their text templating engine. So I adopted a lot of those ideas, and then that's how I got the lexical analyzer done. And once I had that, then I was basically able to get the tokens and figure out the orders and throw errors when there are some wrong tokens, and build an AST, basically a tree. And then basically that tree is like a middle representation I call Q code. The reason I do that is because at that point, anyone can compile it to any kind of dialect. And essentially, the one step that compiles it to SQL is like a module that's separate. It's a separate library that consumes this Q code and then compiles Postgres-specific SQL. Because I did think that maybe someone wants to write something for KSQL or some I don't know, exotic thing or. So yeah, I mean it's essentially a compiler, and yeah, it kind of walks the tree and adds more things to the modules. There are some complications I'm still kind of working through in terms of it's very fast, but SQL, one feature I'm working on now is it's called schema stitching, where you can actually have this engine call out, have some config in there saying, okay, when anyone asks for Stripe, you call the Stripe API with this token and then get that data and just return the fields that I've asked for and kind of stitch it into this. So in the fact that you're walking this tree and you're building SQL into one single query, that's the magic of it. Now, if you have some remote call right in the middle of that's dependent on data from the query, it's kind of complicated. So that kind of, I'm thinking through some of these things. I have to build another a execution graph there to figure out what depends on what, and then make that remote call. And but it's honestly the most fun part of it. So all this other stuff was I just had to do it. So. Including the docs. Yeah.
So along the same question, so is there any other GraphQL library which you need to go? So
so GraphQL is pretty surprisingly, now that I'm working in it, I've been looking around. Before all I saw was something called Apollo, which was super extensive, but it really kind of scared me off. Firstly, it was Node.js. I'm nothing against it. I just didn't want to get in there, and it just needed me to learn all of this and write all this code from scratch or resolvers. They had this whole language, and to me it was okay, I could build this in Rails as REST APIs. I already know that. I don't have to learn this, and then, I don't know. Honestly, I didn't want to build write code for these things. I just wanted to kind of do it, and then there are so many AppSync. Is something I recently found out about that Amazon has. Apparently does something similar to this, but it then starts up Elasticsearch and 15 other things that you pay for. And I think the equal, sorry?
And the load.
Yeah, so I mean, so essentially you can think of this as AppSync that you can kind of deploy in some way. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
So yeah.